have spots? As you see fit.
Righty-ho.
And I think our waters are to our left.
Oh.
Ready?
Very well, very well. How are things? I'm very much enjoying
You look after that, please.
Oh, wow. Celebrity views.
All okay? Right, I think we're ready to start. Thank you all for coming to this CapX event. I'm Joseph, the Deputy Editor of CapX, and today we're going to be talking about Javier Milei, whose economic program of free market reform has transformed Argentina's economic fortunes. So radical is his program that some have called it Thatcherism on steroids. But while I imagine Margaret Thatcher might have been reticent to take advice from an Argentinian, we are going to be talking about what Britain's politicians could potentially learn. And to do that, we have assembled a superstar panel. We have Tom Harwood, a presenter at GB News, Tom Clougherty, the Executive Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Annunziata Rees-Mogg, who is the Director of Communications at Popcon UK, and Jack Rankin, the Member of Parliament for Windsor. So to start off, I'm going to ask a question to the panel, which I'd like you all to answer for a couple of minutes or so. And that question is, which element of Milei's revolution do you most admire and why? Starting with you, Tom.
One word, afuera. I think we've all seen the now very popular TikTok video, which was once an interview with an obscure professor who became a politician sort of by accident, going through all the government departments in Argentina and saying, well, why do we need a ministry for women and equalities? Afuera! Why do we need a culture department? Afuera! Why do we need... And then going through ministry after ministry after ministry. It is extraordinary to see in this country 30 plus people sitting around the cabinet table. You can tell this is a terrible way to manage anything by looking at any wartime. When countries are at war, what happens? They have a war cabinet. You can't direct a war with 30 people around a table. You can't have a meeting with 30 people around a table. No. At the pandemic, the committees, you cut it down to 4 people, 6 people. It's extraordinary that we have 30 plus cabinet ministers who no one in the country can name. I think the biggest, most delicious element of the Javier Milei agenda has been to flat out eliminate government department after government department after government department.
All right, yeah, look, I think the thing that I most admire about Milei's revolution in Argentina is the speed with which he's accomplished deficit reduction or indeed deficit elimination. We haven't balanced a budget in the UK since the turn of the millennium. Since 2010, we've had this constant imperative that we will balance the budget or we'll run a surplus in 5 years' time. But 5 years' time has always been 5 years into the future. We've never got there. We're still running a budget deficit of about 5% of GDP, which is high by developed economy standards at the moment. Milei inherited roughly the same size deficit. He eliminated it in 1 month. So in 1 month, spending was basically cut by a third, and they've been running budget surpluses ever since. So that is the thing that I admire the most, just getting it over and done with. But I also think we should be clear about the difficult trade-offs that you have to make in order to balance the budget that quickly. And I think the crucial thing, one of the crucial things at least, about that 1/3 reduction in spending is that about a quarter of it came from reducing the purchasing power of pensioners in Argentina. So they massively grappled with the age-related liabilities of the state in a way that is very hard to imagine in Britain or probably in any other mature Western democracy. But Milei did it, and he was running surpluses as a result. So that's the thing I admire the most.
I think that had I tried to come here today and bring my chainsaw, there may have been 1 or 2 police people who tried to prevent me from doing so. And I think the most impressive thing about Milei is that he not only took the chainsaw to the departments, but that he was prepared to be that outrageous, that bold, that determined to change things, that you can stand there with a chainsaw and say, this is what I'm going to do. To show your absolute belief, conviction, and determination to change your country. And I think that is something we have lacked in this country. That I don't feel our politicians have had the depth of belief in the future of our country, that it can be better, that we can eliminate our deficit, that we can grow our economy, that we can be great again. And I think he achieved that. Though there are many policies I would disagree with, that strength of conviction can create a lot of good.
Well, I think we're all in danger here of violently agreeing with one another. Apart from on pensions, Tom.
Actually.
The Overton window hasn't moved yet. So the theme of this conference, let me take a different tack, is stronger economy, stronger borders. And I think the focus of this panel might be on the economy. But let me just turn to the borders for a minute. My views on borders are very robust. I believe the failure we had on borders in government is a real reason for the breach in confidence between our party and the electorate. And I obviously want to be part of that change. And I think about, in the 18 months I've been a Member of Parliament, how far the Overton window has moved in borders. If it keeps going for the next 18 months, it might nearly be where my views are. Right. But has it moved on the economy? I don't think it has really yet. But I think there's a fiscal crisis coming in this country. What that looks like, I don't know. There's people better qualified on this panel to talk what that looks like. But when I think that inevitably does happen, I think the Overton window on the economy will move. And so what I admire most about Milei really is that courage to tell the truth. He's found a way of articulating that message, which obviously is very tough decisions. And he's got the conviction and strength to deliver it. And Kemi has been out and said already that she thinks Milei is the template. And I think what she means there is that truth-telling, that courage, that authentic conservatism. And I think that authentic conservatism has to include a great degree of fiscal conservatism. And we have to be clear that spending 100 billion quid a year on debt servicing is unsustainable. 45% of government spending on welfare and pensions. 500,000 new claimants on PIP last year are unsustainable. And I think Kemi has this ability to tell the truth on this and perhaps move us in that direction. It might be unpopular for now, but when that fiscal crisis comes, I think it'll leave our party well placed.
Well, that's all great stuff, but we can't talk about the successes of Milei without giving a little bit of lip service to his recent economic challenges. The Argentinian peso is down. It looks like they're going to have to be bailed out by the Americans. Tom, I was wondering, you're the economist on the panel, if you could talk us through what's happening there and whether we should listen to the naysayers in the Guardian opinion section, for example, who say that we should be writing this guy off, not celebrating him.
So yeah, I always feel I have to admit that I have a law degree, not an economics degree, when I'm billed as an economist, but I am from the Institute of Economic Affairs, so I have a stab at it anyway. Yeah, look, I mean, he has, you'll have seen the headlines probably in the newspapers, been in a little bit of difficulty recently. I think that those difficulties, although they've spilled over into economics, they're largely political. So effectively what's happened is his party, his group, massively underperformed in a recent regional election, and that's given investors, markets, serious fears that his agenda is sustainable and that they're going to be able to stay the course. And so what you've had is people running on the peso, which I think perhaps then quite unwisely the Argentinian government has been trying to prop up. The more they prop up the peso and the more they run out of reserves, the more then the people who are lending them money start to worry, are we going to be paid back? And so they demand higher returns on their lending. So there's an economic angle to it, but I think it's fundamentally a political, it has its beginnings in the political cycle. And this is something, if you're going to be a radical reformer in any country to whatever degree, I think, can you take the people with you and then can you keep the markets on side? These are super important issues that you have to confront. And I do think, by the way, just that probably the one area in which Milei has really departed from free market orthodoxy is on currency matters. Because most people think that the Argentinian peso was significantly overvalued. Unlike, say, Thatcher coming in and immediately abolishing capital controls, he maintained them for a while. Although the peso now partially floats within bands, they're still one of the main goals of their monetary policy is to try and keep the peso trading at a certain exchange rate versus other currencies, not dissimilar in broad strokes from what we had with the European exchange rate mechanism. And some people will remember, I think, what a great economic boon it was to finally just give up and let the currency float freely. Argentina isn't there. He's steered clear of that, and to be clear, this is not just some quirky thing. The fear is, I think, that if they let the peso float freely, its relative value will crash, which is probably justified, and then they'll be importing inflation again. And his main mission, I mean, I said reducing the deficit was the thing I admired the most, and I probably said that because it's most relevant to our current experience, but he also came into office with Argentina facing like 300% a year inflation. I think it was 20% a month, and he's brought it down to 2% a month. Now, 2% a month inflation is still pretty high, but when you've started from 20% a month, it's serious progress. But it's that focus on inflation first, which I think has created a blind spot around the currency, and that's caused a few problems. So we'll see, I think, as the elections come up, how sustainable this agenda is.
And Annunziata, Milei is, of course, not a lone free marketeer in having been a victim of the bond markets. What do you think, if the economic crisis settles and Milei goes back to his positive economic revolution, do you think that here in Britain, his success could go some way in repairing the reputational damage done to free markets by a certain former Prime Minister?
When he first won, the financial markets were terrified of what he wanted to do and thought he was going to sink the country. They reacted to him in a not dissimilar way to the elephant in the room you haven't mentioned, Liz Truss.
Oh, that's who he's talking about.
Oh, he meant Rishi.
That markets can be easily spooked by bold actions. He, however, ploughed on and had the ability to do so. The electoral system is very different there. Ours is in some ways much more stable. I'm afraid the Tories are quite fond of occasionally throwing out our leader, and Liz Truss was got rid of before any of her policies could come in. There is a definite comms argument that she tried to do too much too soon. But Milei went much further, much harder, and very, very quickly, and got away with it. Their positions are not, in that sense, totally dissimilar. But how can you communicate to the financial community, but also to all the people who pay the tax, who receive either the pensions or don't receive the pensions that I know Tom wants to talk about, but how do you explain to the people and to the people providing the money that these big, very harsh actions need to be taken? And I think that brings us back to why Liz Truss could not succeed where Milei could, is that Argentina genuinely had a severe crisis going on. That how many of us in this room can actually imagine 211% inflation every year, and what that would do to how you live, how you feed your family? It is, you'd end up with wheelbarrows to go and buy your weekly shop full of money. And he took advantage of a crisis to get through crisis answers. We were not in a total crisis situation when Liz Truss became our Prime Minister. Maggie Thatcher was very bold. She had huge plans. There was a crisis just before in 78, 79. But even so, she actually laid the groundwork to make sure the country was in a position to take the cuts, to also be able to provide the tax cuts from which we then benefited. And I think going in like a bull at a gate can only work when your country is in severe economic crisis.
You wanted to interject, Jim?
Yeah, I just coming on there. You know, I am a Mancunian, not from Windsor. You might hear that from my voice. Don't tell my constituents. And I was struck by Andy Burnham's comments last week, where he kind of criticised the bond markets, right? Well, if I owe the bank, you know, more than my income, and they stipulate these conditions for my mortgage, that's not the bank being unfair with me. They're my, you know, they've lent me the money, right? If they want to impose those conditions, that's the case. And I think perhaps the difference between Milei and Liz, if I may, is that, you know, the problem with her budget wasn't it, that it was back to front, in the sense that, you know, the spending came before the cuts, whereas he's come in, I think, 9 months, took his primary budget deficit from 5% to 0%. That's cutting state expenditure by 30% in 9 months. And obviously then I think he's gained the credibility to then be a bit more radical in other spaces. So if we want a radicalism that, you know, we can kind of live with, then we've got to live within our means, haven't we, first and foremost?
Yeah.
That can also, though, make you far more unpopular before you've got anything done at all. And instead of losing the bond markets, you lose your population support. So you can be absolutely hamstrung whichever way round you do it, and I think you only get away with it when there is a severe fiscal crisis.
Although, of course, as we started this conversation, Milei is now having some trouble. In a couple of months, there are legislative elections across the whole country, midterm elections modelled on the US system. He already doesn't have a majority in Congress. If that goes down, if his coalition of support falls further, then, of course, his reform agenda runs into the roadblocks, and suddenly what you have is a far less investable option, a paralysed government. In some ways, there are some funny synchronicities with what happened with Liz Truss, because there were things, supply-side reforms that she tried to get through, that then you had a whole bunch of Conservative MPs rebel against. And it was that disunity within the parliamentary party that really undermined much of Liz Truss's agenda, although I think Conservatives will always run into a problem if we try and pretend that Liz Truss was in every way a free market prime minister, that she was a standard bearer of the free market movement. Let's not forget the first policy she announced upon becoming prime minister was a price control on energy prices, a massive subsidy on our energy in this country that, if at the time it was that it was announced, if energy prices had remained like that and the winter was harsh, thankfully the winter was mild, if the winter had been as bad as we feared, it would have cost twice the cost of furlough. Twice the cost of furlough to pay half the country's energy bills. And that was the first thing this Prime Minister announced. I mean, no wonder the bond markets got worried about Britain's ability to pay back what we owe. And then on top of that, what you have is the Bank of England doing quantitative tightening. And then on top of that, what you have is 50 billion quid in tax cuts. So when you have a whole bunch of quantitative tightening from the Bank of England, when you have £200 billion of spending on everyone's energy bills, and then you add £50 billion of tax cuts on top of that, it's not that tax cuts in and of themselves are a bad thing to do. It's that international investors look at this country and think they've gone loopy. They've gone absolutely loopy. So I think it's always going to be a problem if Conservatives say everything Liz Truss did was right, because no one in the country believes that. I think not even Liz Truss. And perhaps there needs to be more of a free market critique of her socialist price controls that sent the markets haywire.
You were talking earlier about pensions, and you codified your views on this in a fantastic piece that was published on your Substack, that was republished in CapX, and you'll have to go and read. But it was about the amount of praise that's been heaped on Milei by lots of British politicians of the right for his courage, his boldness, and his positive, transformative sort of effect. Why are we seemingly so incapable of accepting the trade-offs here? To reform things like pensions, to cut spending, that kind of thing.
No, so the piece opened with pointing to Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Boris Johnson, Kemi Badenoch, all of these big figures of the centre-right of British politics who had, in speech after speech, praised the bold and radical actions of Javier Milei. And then it followed up with that, with all of their criticisms of a cut to universal winter fuel subsidies. The idea that the state should continue paying Richard Branson's winter fuel costs to heat Rishi Sunak's swimming pool, that this is a good use of taxpayers' money. The Conservatives launched a website, www.keepwinterfuel.com. What you had was campaigns of the right against the most minuscule cursory cut that could possibly be imagined. But it was a politically potent cut, because lots of sharp-elbowed, middle-class people were getting a £200 or £300 payment every winter and suddenly would no longer be getting that payment. And that is a very difficult political thing to deliver. In fact, I've come to the view that it would have been easier, that Rachel Reeves would have got less heat if she had moved the triple lock-on pensions down to a double lock-on pensions and kept the winter fuel subsidy. She'd have saved more money and got less political heat. And what we come back to here is what is possible. The piece I wrote ended with the fact that in recent history, Argentina has been through 9 sovereign debt defaults. 9. I mean, this is the most extraordinary level of crisis. Personally, I don't want Britain to go through 1, 2, 3, or 9 sovereign debt defaults before we get a Milei. But I fear that that is the sort of crisis that a country needs to reach before you get the chainsaw out. So you then get to the point where we need to have discussions in terms of what is politically feasible, what coalitions can be built, and what are the clever coalition-building ways that you can sort of trade to get spending down. I do understand how potent the winter fuel cut was, but looking on a spreadsheet, what a drop in the ocean. But are there better ways, more collaborative ways where people can understand this? I don't want to witter on forever and ever, but I do have one little thing that perhaps Liz Truss could have done in place of the energy subsidy. At the same time, she wanted to liberalise fracking, natural shale gas exploitation on land in the country. But she didn't tie these two things together. What if she, as Prime Minister, had got everyone into the shiny new press briefing room, stood at the lectern, delivered a speech to the nation saying, we are in an energy crisis. I am willing to subsidise your energy bills, but in order to do this, the price will be that we extract our own darn energy. That's how we fund it. That's how we fund it. If that was the bargain offered to the country, would Parliament have brought Liz Truss down? I mean, the evening she was brought down was the manic vote over fracking. I mean, had that been tied to the subsidy, had some clever politics been applied, could it have all gone a very different way?
And Jack, just before we open it up to the floor, we've just heard about the widespread fury at Labour having the temerity to go after people's winter fuel. Could it possibly be that there's just no major political constituency for this kind of free market radicalism, that people just aren't prepared to stomach the trade-offs?
So I think Annunciata is right, and I didn't mean that as an attack when I came at you there a little bit, that they'll have to, radicalism will have to come off the back of a crisis. And I think that's coming. I think there is then a patriotic, broad case that the country needs to be brought on in that process. And I think what Tom says there about tying the things together is true. One of the reasons why we'll struggle to take pensions is because the social contract in this country is broken. So people are trying to get as much out of the system as possible. So if you try to cut people's pensions or winter fuel, people would say, well, that's going on welfare or that's going on migrants. That's what people would think and that's what they would say. When we try to build houses in this country, people think again, well, this is going, to migrants, right? We need to make a patriotic case to our current voters that the triple lock situation is not sustainable in the longer term and that we need to build houses, but we need to do that in a broad way where we bring the country with us. And then I think the Conservative Party can get itself out of this catch-22 situation whereby at the moment we can't cut pensions because all our voters are over the age of 70. But if we don't cut pensions, then we're not going to have any voters who aren't over the age of 70. Yep. So, and I think that is part of building a new, broader coalition, and that has to include new professionals wanting to get on the housing ladder. We need to obviously build millions of houses in this country. This is part of the supply-side revolution that we need, and Milei is showing us the way, as well as looking at marginal rates of tax on work and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, I think it's time for a bit of audience participation. My colleague has got a mic over there, so if you'd like to ask a question, she'll come to this chap here in the glasses.
Kemi has said the next election is about 4 years away, so there's no point making promises now and trying to figure out how to do it later. With Milei saying afuera, everyone knew what they were voting for getting into him. If forgetting as to whether the hearts and minds of the British people will allow a British Milei to be elected, just thinking about the Bank of England and the civil service, do you think that a British Milei would even be allowed to do what Milei has done in Argentina?
Tom?
I think one of the most pathetic things about our politicians over the course of the last 20 years is pretending that they don't have power that they do have. I mean, yes, it's true, there are lots of quangos that make lots of rules, but Parliament is sovereign. Yes, it's true that ministers don't have power sometimes within their area of competence, because that's been palmed out to arm's length bodies and all the rest of it. But ultimately, Parliament is sovereign. If you really want to make a decision, if you really want to make that decision, you can change the law. You can pass a law. Ultimately, in this country, the highest authority in the land post-2020 is the British Parliament. So I don't think it's an excuse for politicians to say this power is not within our gift, because they can change the way that things are done. The one exception, of course, is through implementing executive actions through a so-called independent civil service. A so-called independent civil service, many of the people who work there are lovely, many of whom are my family members, and I don't want to besmirch them in any way. But I will say this, they can be institutionally sticky. I don't think are hardline Marxist-Leninists, but I think they would, they're perhaps squeamish at the prospect of reform. And if their lives are easier by not doing that reform, that perhaps is the easiest path to take, the path of least resistance. I think there is a massive case for having a more political civil service. Why are our policy, why do government departments have entire policy teams that are apolitical? You have policy teams that are civil servants. So the new health secretary gets in and he wants to appear like he's being busy, and on his desk, the policy team in his own department hand him a bunch of policies. Let's ban smoking for anyone born after the year 2007. Let's stop smoking in the outside of parks and playgrounds and hotels and the rest of it. I've spoken to former special advisors in that department. These things have been sitting on the shelf for decades. And every new time there's a new Secretary of State, the civil service just try it on. Just, yeah, do you want to get this done? And it's sort of mad to me that you have policy people working in these departments that aren't political, and that one minister in a department of perhaps thousands of civil servants has 3 or 4 special advisors to fight his or her corner. I mean, that is, I think a lot of people would say you don't want an entirely political civil service. Of course you don't. But my goodness me, a ratio of 4 to 4,000 is a little bit skew-whiff. And I would have thought that you could have had a larger political team around the Secretary of State to get an agenda through, to get an agenda done.
Oh, another question. Oh,
well, I'll take that. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on it. So, when there's people often have negativity about the state of this country, I always are thankful for our constitution, because as Tom says, Parliament is sovereign, it can do what it likes, right? So the question is, you know, would the blob, let's call it that, try to stop a radical government like Milei? Now, it would at the moment is the answer, right? And, you know, we can look at the law, okay? So the Secretary of State for Energy is not in charge of energy policy in this country. The Climate Change Committee, created by the Climate Change Act, is sovereign over energy policy in this country. But you can get rid of the Climate Change Act with a majority in Parliament. We've committed to do so. ECHR is the same, Human Rights Act is the same, the Equalities Act is the same. All these things choose to turn political decisions, which should be decided in the divisions of the House of Commons, into legal decisions. So a day one government needs to sort out the law. We need to sort out the civil service. In Douglas Carswell's essay, Milestones, he talks about using orders in council a lot. I think that's a little bit outdated. I think we just use single-line bills which give ministers the power to use ministerial direction. When I look at the quangos, talk to any MP dealing with them, flooding is a big issue in my constituency. The EA told me my flood scheme in my constituency couldn't go ahead because it was not aligned with their strategic directions, because it didn't increase biodiversity. Right, so we need to get rid of those. So a government to be simply radical, and deliver this agenda needs to have a plan on day one, on laws, on civil service, on quangos, to re-empower Parliament. And we need to, you talked about a fuego of government departments, but we need to take it to this, what I call the Blairite constitutional construct, so we can re-empower Parliament and ministers accountable to it.
Fantastic. Chap in the hat over here.
Yeah, it's Conservative YIMBY Build Baby Build hat. The question I'm going to ask is, so at the moment, the big issue with housing, the way I see it, is parties, especially our party, engage with a very small section of the electorate who oppose development, and therefore we think that the public oppose development. But really there's a silent majority out there which statistic over statistic proves support development en masse. And what are your views on that? How can we engage that silent majority so politicians feel like the public consent is there for development to occur? That's my question.
Was that to Jack in particular? Oh, to everyone? Tom, do you fancy having a crack at that?
Yeah, I mean, look, just do it in general Milei terms first, although I might have more specific thoughts as well. I mentioned bringing down inflation and eliminating the deficit. I think what people sleep on a little bit with Javier Milei is how strong the deregulatory agenda is. And Argentina is a massively overregulated country. I think it ranks something like 148 out of 162 countries in terms of how heavy the regulatory burden is. And this has been a major focus of his government. And I think one of the things that's interesting kind of methodologically about how they've approached it is to try and look for areas where things in Argentina cost more than they do in other parts of the world, and then think, is there some regulatory reason why stuff is more expensive in Argentina than elsewhere in the world? And then they're getting rid of that or they're reforming. And I think if you did that in the UK, you'd very quickly look at energy prices, particularly for businesses, but you'd also look at the enormous cost of housing, which is very, very largely a regulatory construct. But again, this is one of those areas where so many governments, because it's not rocket science to say, we don't build enough houses. Lots of governments say we're going to build more. Most of them crumble at the first sign of opposition, I think because they've been unsophisticated in how they go about these things. And I really think that you have to think through very carefully the different institutions and different incentives that you have set up. Because at the end of the day, if you've empowered lots of people to block a process, which they feel they're going to lose out from, they will do exactly that. And I think the mistake that Conservatives made and that other governments make as well is just to think with enough political will and with enough pressure from the centre, we can get a lot more built and then people will be happy with us and they'll vote for us. And I don't think that works even on its own terms. You have to really reinvent the whole system and come up with a way to align incentives so that local communities benefit from building. Long story short.
Take another question. This man at the front. Thanks, Nicole.
I'm a former Bank of England economist and investment bank economist. The big thing about Liz Truss versus Milei was Liz Truss had the Office for Budget Responsibility, which she failed to go to. She put a budget through in all but name and failed to ask the OBR what the forecasts were. I don't think Milei has that problem, so that's a big difference. The second thing is, if I haven't looked at the Argentinian situation recently, but if the peso is fixed in a band, and if it was free, it would crash, and Argentina has exchange controls, which we don't have, I don't think Milei is so great, despite him having been a professor of economics.
Is there a question there?
No.
But it was an excellent statement.
Well put. Let's go to this gentleman here.
Question really for all members of the panel, but it's sparked by something Tom said. You're now in government and you do have the right to abolish some government departments. You can have as many as you like, and a bonus point if one of them's a treasury.
Right. Do we need to abolish the Treasury? Jack, over to you.
I don't know the answer to that. I'll maybe have a crack at Alex's question over there. On
Yeah, go for it.
So if I ask my office what is the most common topic that is written to me on as Member of Parliament, the answer will be Palestine, right? Does anyone in this room think the biggest concern of the people of the Windsor County constituency is Palestine? Right. Obviously it's not, right? The first rule in politics is the people shouting the loudest very rarely represent.
Are all the letters the same?
Pretty much, yes. In many cases they are, yeah. And that's the problem with the planning system, right? It empowers the people that wish to complain, okay? So I have a prosperous, green, rural constituency. If you went onto the planning portal of the Royal Borough of Windsor Maidenhead when there was a significant planning application, it would be stacked with people who live in £1 million houses objecting to development near them, right? And so as a member of parliament, you read that and you think, oh God, right, I need to be on the right side of this village. But it's the same thing as the Palestine issue, right? There are millions and millions of people in this country who desperately want more homes to be built, right? And then we wonder why my generation, if I might say so, is not conservative. Well, it's because it can't, through a hard-working industry, improve its life and build capital, right? So we need a much more representative planning system which tries to encounter those views in the planning system, and we need to have the courage of our convictions to say to people in our villages, because the same people who write those letters will be the exact same people who, when the council want to close down my primary schools, and some of my primary schools will close in the next few years because young families can't live there, again, it's about telling that story that Tom, it's webbing them together. Do you want the primary school to close, or do you want the houses? They're the two kind of things. On the Treasury, I've read interesting things about the... I think we need a government, an office of the Prime Minister, don't we? And we need those strategic decisions to sit there at the heart of a department for the Prime Minister, and maybe the bean counting to sit in a more finance department.
Another question. At the back there, just there.
Yes. We've spoken a lot about the civil service, the blob, or potentially the Bank of England. Do you worry that the difference between a Keynesian economic view and a classical economic view could potentially be another stick in the spokes of a British Milei?
So the question being disunity among sort of popular economic thought?
Disunity between the politicians and potentially the OBR, the Monetary Policy Committee, or the Bank of England itself.
Nunziata, do you see these institutions as...
I see these institutions as defunct. I think they are huge brakes on our economy. I think the OBR, you can go and check for yourself, but has never got any forecast anywhere close to right since it was brought into existence, shamefully, by a Conservative Chancellor. It needs to go. It isn't adding anything to our economic prospects and, in fact, harms them. As, unfortunately, does the Bank of England. And the Bank of England's policies have been disastrous. That when we need restraint, it pumps in money, and when we need money, it pumps up the restraint. And it is not fit for purpose in its current state. I think we do want a Bank of England. I don't actually want Rachel Reeves to have absolute control over every lever, but not one that operates in the way that it does. And I think we have all seen what quantitative easing has done to the economy in our country, particularly over COVID, but well before that as well. I think when it comes to the civil service, that there is a real concern that their views don't align with the politicians that we all vote into office. And I doubt very many of us voted for the current bunch that happen to be in Downing Street and Whitehall at the moment, but we should still have a stake in that. And I heard an interview recently from, I think it was Stella Creasy, and in '97 she became an environment minister, and she had to give a big speech on the environment. And so she said to her civil servants, here, this is the manifesto, here's what we said, could I have a speech? And she got it back, and it didn't mention a single thing that she had asked to be in it. And she said, oh, well, this doesn't say what I asked for it to say. And they said, oh, no, we'll have a rework. And by now it's Monday night and the speech is on Wednesday. And she gets it back on Tuesday afternoon, and it's still exactly the same speech with a couple of sentences tweaked marginally, but saying things that were not Labour policy. So she goes to the parliamentary library and she looks up last year's speech by the Conservative Minister for the Environment, and it's the same speech. They had recycled it despite a massive landslide and a change in government. That there is a resistance to not do what they've always done. And I don't think it's necessarily ideological. I don't think that it is necessarily left-wing versus right-wing, or that it's whether you want Keynesian or free market economies. it is a reluctance to change. This is how we have always done it, and therefore we will keep doing it this way. Keep watching Yes Minister. It is truer than you could believe, but that whole psychological basis for our civil service has to change, and I think our civil service has to become politically appointed so that ministers don't have permanent resistance and can get through the measures that you and I and everyone across this country votes them into power in order to do.
Yeah. Tom, you wanted to...
Yeah. I mean, just very briefly to pull that question and the one before together. I mean, I would afuera most of Whitehall. It's probably easier to say which bits I'd keep, and it probably would include the Treasury, I'm afraid to say, than the pieces I'd get rid of. But I actually don't see the OBR as the problem here. Yes, their forecasts are wrong, but all economic forecasts are wrong more than a year or two out. That's just the nature of economic forecasting. Yes, their models are probably a bit crap, especially when it comes to trying to model kind of pro-growth policy changes. But personally, especially with the government of the left that would run up spending as much as they possibly could if they were allowed to get away with it, I'm quite glad to have the Office for Budget Responsibility there. And I think it's a mistake for fiscal conservatives to say, let's get rid of the OBR because it constrains what we can do, when really the constraint is it's telling you you have to balance a budget in 5 years' time. This should not be a big constraint for any conservative government. And if it is, then I think you have to look deeper and say, what else are we getting wrong here?
Yeah. If there was a surplus being run, it wouldn't matter a fig whether the OBR forecasts were massively over or under positive.
If Rachel Reeves could borrow till her heart's content, we might be rid of this absolute shower of a Labour government much more quickly.
Sovereign debt crisis number one. There we go. Yeah.
Another question. Nicole, this chap down here in the glasses, they both have glasses, in the blue shirt without a blazer.
Given Argentina can reliably, fall apart every 5 to 10 years, do you think there's some worry that this whole panel and Kemi herself putting themselves behind Milei, this won't last forever, that something might go wrong, egg might be on the faces of everyone here, and maybe Kemi too? Do you worry about that?
Tom?
I don't think anyone is going to vote at the next election on the basis of what the leader of the Conservative Party said about an Argentine politician. I do think it's instructive to have conversations like this and point to where things are going well and where things are going badly. I think it's really instructive to look at where political coalitions can fall apart and what pro-growth measures actually can build support and can be delivered. Ultimately, is everyone going to pay attention to every jot and tittle of Argentine politics? Do they in the good times? Do they in the bad times? Well, have there been any good times since Perón got in? But I think this is one of those questions that I think is almost academic and not relevant to people's lives. The three biggest election issues every single time: health, economy, migration. Let's be real, Reform is going to own migration at the next election. The Tories are trying today to cauterise the wound, not to get ahead of them. Labour's going to own health. Perhaps ironically, if they actually get waiting lists down, it will be less of an election issue, and that might do themselves a bit less favour. But the Tories have an opportunity to be real when it comes to the economy. Should they tie their colours to the mast of any other country in the world? Absolutely not. And I think, on your point, it was absolutely mad for so many people, and particularly Reform politicians, to sing the praises of Doge in the United States, not a government department, and not particularly efficient. I mean, the US deficit has gone up. The US deficit has gone up in the last, by hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, there has been no net saving at all under this Trump administration. To say that Trump has saved money or to model anything in the UK off the basis of Doge is such a bad idea, because the deficit has shot way up. It's one of the reasons Elon Musk crashed so theatrically out of government in the United States. So yes, absolutely, don't tie yourself too closely to any foreign politician, but where a foreign politician is doing something wisely, absolutely look at that and absolutely talk about that. But should Kemi Badenoch appear on stage with a chainsaw anytime soon? Perhaps not.
Another question. This gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Just to come back to the question, does the panel think we have a Milei? Do they see any politician with the commitment and I think importantly the competence, which Liz Truss didn't have, to be able to do that? And Jack, you are allowed to say yourself if you think so.
Yeah.
Jack?
So to Tom's point, I think we should try to learn from other countries, but not necessarily, they might rhyme, but they're not the same, right? So do I think that the chainsaw kind of piece would work in the UK? I think the English would probably not quite sit with our temperament. I think what we need to see, what we do need to see, and Annunciata's talked to this point, is kind of a patriotic radicalism which is deeply trying to fix the country's issues. And I think that starts with brutal honesty about what's gone wrong in the past and telling people truths. And I think Kemi absolutely has that moral clarity and certainty on this. Where I might be, slightly critical is we have to get the comms much better, right? There's too much in the Conservative Party. Oh, well, we've done the work on the document now. I've made the speech of policy exchange, so now the country knows that we're good on borders. Now, we obviously, we need to get up every day in the morning and do the morning round every day. We need a Twitter video. We need to be on we need to be on Facebook. We need to be on GB News late, right? You need to be tweeting incessantly, right? There needs to be a whole comms narrative alongside this kind of thoroughly worked through policy, which is radical, cuts through the blob, and is deliverable. And I think that is our particular gap at the minute. And so when I say the chainsaw I don't think works in a British context, but those visuals and that headline grabbing and that kind of capturing the zeitgeist is something that we are short of at the minute, I would say.
Annunciata, I wonder if you could chime in on that. Comms expert.
I think we all try and get our points across, but I think you're absolutely right that the Tories need to be putting their message across all the time. But the piece that I think is still missing is why. Why do we want to do all these things? That it's got to come from basic values. Why are we all here? Why have we come up to what, when I first arrived, was a very rainy Manchester in order to stand up and be part of our country? And what are the values that's driven that? And I think we have lost in the depths of the policy details, in the intricacies of whether we reform the Human Rights Act or leave the ECHR, why it matters. What is it about being conservative that drives us to want lower taxes, to want free markets, to want an economy that is not run by the state for the state? And I don't think we've explained that piece. And I think that, to some extent, does have to be enunciated. It's got to be translated into why, as Maggie did, it is each and every individual that matters. Why do we want houses built? At the moment, I think if you went up to an average small rural town and said, we want to put another 1,000 houses here, everyone would say, no thanks, you'll just house migrants. They might well be wrong, but that would be the perception. They don't think that these things are being done for the best interests of the British people, not for the best interests of their communities. And unless you can explain and constantly repeat why the Conservatives have the British people at their heart, no policy is going to cut through.
Charles down here, just on the front row.
This is one for you.
Jack, you say we need radical change.
Yeah.
Could you outline a 2% cut to state expenditure, which is about £24 billion?
Fair question, Charles. So the first place that I would go is welfare. So, for example, we have 2.6 million people in this country who are out of work on sickness benefit. The masses of increase of that we've seen since the COVID pandemic is physically healthy people in their 20s and 30s who claim mental health conditions, anxiety and depression. The worst thing in the world, if you're in your 20s and 30s and have got mental health problems, is to sit at home and do nothing, right? It's not only sticking them on the scrap heap, it's unfair on wider society. And if you'd have come to me a few years ago on welfare, I'd have said, oh, well, it's carrot and stick. I'd have given a two kind of pronged answer. I've said, yes, we do need to cut welfare. There's a moral reason for both the recipient and the person paying for it on welfare. But we also need to invest in skills and things. I'm afraid that my patience on the latter has somewhat snapped. And I think that we're going to have to use a lot more stick than carrot. I'm afraid, Charles, that that's not a costed policy right now, but you might tell me whether that gets anywhere close to 2%. But I'd be very, very radical on welfare.
As someone who's read an embargoed press release for 10 o'clock tonight, perhaps there's something that the Tory party's going to say about this on Economy Day tomorrow.
Oh, it's not just because I've just said it.
Let's go for another question. Just at the back there, next to you, Nicole. You've got a microphone if you'd like one.
I hope Annunziata will please forgive me for this, but to my mind there is a radical distrust of the difference between form and substance. And this Conservative Party, of which I have been a supporter for more years than I care to admit, is just as guilty as some of the most egregiously outrageous nonsense perpetrated by His Majesty's government. We must try to persuade the public that we are not talking bull. We have a major credibility problem with the vast majority of the population who regard politicians as some weird people with antennae sticking out of their head. We have every need of our own Milei, but we must first of all sort out our own domestic politics. Do you believe that we can cross this gap? Do you believe that we can persuade the British electorate that Keir Starmer, my learned friend, is talking a lot of rubbish and we are not? Because we know that Keir Starmer is talking a lot of rubbish, but we have yet to prove that we are not. This is the greatest electoral challenge before, let us hope it is earlier, because I suspect Keir will have to resign. Let us hope that it is earlier than the next general election scheduled in 2029, is it? I forget. Let's get rid of this bunch of socialists as soon as possible. And I think we're going quite well about it, but this is a political chicanery which doesn't resound with the English people. How can we improve our political presentation?
Annunziata?
I think it is no one thing. I think we desperately do need to hear and hear repeatedly, as Jack says, in the morning, during the day, on the evening news, constantly on social media. We've got to be on TikTok, as Tom cheerfully said. We will all have seen the TikTok. I think if I did a poll of most Conservative Party members, there's a minority who have ever used TikTok. But we've got to appeal to all ages, and one of Millei's great strengths is that he has got the youth vote hugely behind him. And that has been the game-changing part of the electorate for him. But we need to express our values, our principles, why these things matter, why they will improve individuals' lives, improve community strength, improve family stability, how they make our lives better. And then we've got to make sure we have got the detail, that for day one, we've got to explain how we will repeal the parts that do not work, the laws that are holding us back and preventing things happening, how we can change planning, not just so that everyone has nuclear mini reactors dumped on their doorsteps, but to explain not only that we'll let people say in that area might get cheaper electricity, but also it is building an economy which will make everyone better off. We have got to do the explaining of the whys as well as the practicalities of the individual policies, which Kemi appears to be doing a good job of nailing, but the detail. We've got to know from day one, whether it's 2029, and I don't currently see a mechanism to get rid of this government before then, even if Keir Starmer goes. I would love it if he did. But we have got to be ready for that very first day to know which bills have to go, which quangos have to be scrapped, which redundancies have to be prepared for and costed. Because don't make a mistake that those quangos employ thousands and thousands of people. And by bringing those powers back to democratically elected politicians, you will cost jobs. Those details have to be nailed, but the values and the reasons and the benefits for the public have to be explained as well.
Annunciata, I'm so glad you said that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Stole her applause.
I'm so sorry. That is the meanest thing any co-panelist can ever do. I owe you a drink. I'm so glad you made the point about Keir Starmer going and whether or not that could bring about an election. Traditionally, when parties do worse in the polls, the longer the parliament goes. John Major dragged out his parliament as long as possible. Gordon Brown left it until the last possible moment he could call a general election. If this government is doing poorly, expect the election to be later. If it starts doing well, expect it to be sooner. But also, I would put a word of caution into cheering on the removal of Keir Starmer. Do you know who the Labour List survey's most popular cabinet minister amongst Labour members is right now?
Miliband.
Ed Miliband. So if you want to get rid of Keir Starmer, the remainder of the 4 years left in this parliament, you'll have Prime Minister Miliband. I don't know if people would prefer that or not. It would be a brave thing for a Conservative Party polling on 16 or 17% to be agitating for a general election in this moment in time. Tempting though it is to have a flight of fancy, perhaps it's not in the world of realism.
We have time for one more very quick question, just the far right corner of the room there, over to Alex.
Thanks, Joe. On the OBR, would Milei have been able to do what he did if there was no OBR? And also, of course, Margaret Thatcher, who in 1981, 361 or 381 economists wrote saying the economics profession disagrees with you, Margaret. So on that point, those who've been defending the OBR, I would suggest that both Milei and Thatcher could not have done what they wanted. And I'll add to that quickly, they also score policies. So when we were letting in huge numbers of unskilled migrants, perhaps infused by their own policy, their own views, they said this is a great idea. They've now come back and said, actually, we totally made it up, and these people are going to cost us a lot of money. So I'm just sort of interested in those 2 points.
Yeah. Tom, go for it.
I think if you told the OBR you were going to balance the budget next month, they'd be cock-a-hoop. I don't really see why they'd stand in the way of that. There may be lots of problems with the OBR, but I think insisting on balanced budgets in the long run is not one of those things. So, I mean, I think this is a general consensus, right, that a radical free market agenda will run up against institutional roadblocks in government, and I think it clearly will. But I think part of the problem is that we not only do we not really have the detailed solutions and the plans, which we've talked about, we haven't really solved the problem yet. I don't think that the public is really awake to the scale of the challenges that we have, but I also think if we pretend the only problem is the OBR won't let us spend enough or cut taxes enough, we're not going to get to that shared understanding that we need to underlie a kind of radical reform agenda.
Well, I'll have a correct.
Very quick.
Yeah, I'll have a crack. I'm quite sceptical about the OBR. I share a lot of the Annunciata's views. I was educated to be a research physicist, and I don't understand why we don't have plus or minuses on any numbers. Yeah. If I had a 0.2%, I would have had to have put a plus or minus 0.4% on it. And I don't trust what the OBR tells me economic growth is going to be in 4 years, because it can't literally tell me what economic growth was 3 months ago. So I take that view. Where I diverge a little bit is I think because of what happened with the mini-budget, I don't think we can get rid of the OBR. So I think in the instance, and maybe it's to this gentleman, nub of his question, criticising the Treasury, we need to get into, and I think the OBR kind of scores things kind of statically, doesn't it, right? It raises taxes by 5%, okay, there's 5% more revenue. It cut taxes by 5%, there's 5% less revenue. I think we need much more free market thinking in there so we can properly score supply side reforms so we can have a radical agenda. But I think if you message that and roll the pitch, which is obviously not what happened, then I think we can get to a situation where we can keep these safeguards, but they can operate how more like we want to see them.
Right, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, and if you join me in thanking the panel.